Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Agnieszka, for the invitation. It's a pleasure to talk about the work I've been part of. Over the next 20 minutes, I'll talk you through the process of cataloging the provenance of New Zealand's incunabula in MEI. This work was really enjoyable, so I'm also grateful to Cristina Dondi for trusting me with it. I picked this title knowing it's quite broad, but I wanted to introduce you to the library, to its collection and the story behind it, and to take you through the cataloging process, obviously, and one particular interesting finding. Our starting point is the Alexander Turnbull Library in Wellington. It's a part of the wider rare books and fine printing collection within the National Library of New Zealand. It began as the private collection of Alexander Turnbull, a Wellington businessman and bibliophile. Initially, his ambition was to gather works relating to the country from earliest times, and obviously early printed books weren't his main focus. Turnbull owned only 16 incunabula, but with later purchases and donations, the collection now holds 114 copies. A few months ago, Anthony Tedeschi, the curator of rare books and early manuscripts, generously shared document listing all the libraries in incunabula, so we could add them to MEI. And my thanks to him for sharing the material and understanding why this kind of provenance research matters. Because the copies weren't digitized, our only sources were his file, the online catalog, and the photos of provenance evidence, like ownership inscriptions, book plates, marginal notes, so anything of interest. And the photos helped us identify some owners and enrich the records in different CERL databases, not only in MEI. And while working with the document and the online catalog, and while comparing them, I found several discrepancies. For instance, under one shelf mark, the catalog entry was ambiguous and seemed to point to 2 copies, while the curator's file listed only 1. And please keep this in mind because we'll come back to it a bit later. Of all the copies I added, 5 were the first of the additions to IP and MEI. And as you can see from my STC, we only know about a small number of surviving copies of these editions. And by the way, while preparing this talk, I found out about the last one, attributed to Augustine. Only 4 copies are known, according to ISTC. And in May, John Goldfinch added a record for a copy held at the British Library. So cases like this show how much work still needs to be done to track down copies and that they could turn up anywhere, literally in libraries all over the world. And I think it's an interesting example of a copy's journey. And for me, it's all still a work in progress. I'm in touch with Anthony Tedeschi, the curator, and I hope to continue the collaboration. So a quick tour of the collection. Even though it's a relatively small holding, 114 copies, as I said, I still wanted to pick out a few patterns and show them to you. For example, most of the collection was printed in the 1480s and 1490s, and Venice is the single largest place of printing. While researching the provenance, I discovered that almost every copy can be traced back to the moment it was acquired. So speaking in MEI terms, each record usually has more than one provenance block. And the provenance evidence also indicates how the collection grew. And I showed here with a donut chart as 3 waves. It began in 1920 with 25 books, including Turnbull bequest. Then the library bought most of its copies in the mid-20th century from European and local booksellers and at auctions. And about a third are more recent acquisitions. And if we look at the types of acquisition, it turns out that almost half are bequests. And in second place are the library's own purchases. And this slide shows the top 5 former owners. For instance, 19 books came from the estate of John Barton, which makes his bequest the most significant. I found very little information about him. He was a book collector and independent researcher from New Plymouth who named his collection the Dalberton Library. He was born in Essex in England and immigrated to New Zealand in 1956, where he worked at a bookstore. And that's basically it. And so while adding the record for each copy to MEI, I also substantially enriched the Owners of Incunabula database. Before this work, there was no information there on New Zealand collectors and institutions. At the moment, 12 cities and 30 owners are plotted on the map, including auction houses and booksellers, as well as religious institutions and ordinary book collectors. And of course, it's only just a starting point, like a small glimpse into how these collections formed and how the owners were connected. And this analysis would have been impossible, or at least very difficult, without the data I first added into MEI and could then download from it as a structured data set. Now let's go back in time and look at the European former owners. Some of the books from this collection, books of theological and philosophical nature, came onto the market after the secularization of German monasteries in the 19th century. This slide shows a few examples of those ownership inscriptions. And it's no surprise that the books found their way to the UK and into the hands of someone like Bernard Quaritch, a name I imagine you're quite familiar with. Yes, here are a few more examples. A copy of Bonaventura's Sermons belonged to Nicolaus Medler, a Lutheran reformer and associate of Martin Luther. This copy later entered a Franciscan monastery in Bavaria, and from there traveled through London to Wellington. Another example, a copy of late medieval sermons, was once owned by William Morris, the founder of the famous Kelmscott Press. And the last one is a copy of satirical poems belonging to Petrus Scriverius, the 17th century Dutch historian, writer, and book collector. And this copy is actually part of a Samel band, bound together with 3 other classical works later in the mid-18th century. Overall, there is a noticeable amount of German provenance. As I mentioned, many of the books were once held in monasteries or churches of different religious orders. Several copies also belong to English and Italian aristocratic owners, and many passed through the hands of well-known booksellers. Remember how at the beginning of my talk, I mentioned that while comparing the curator's document with the online catalog, I found a copy that wasn't properly recorded. Basically, the library held 2 copies of the same edition under one shelf mark, which naturally caused some problems. The edition is Lives of the Popes, considered the first systematic history of the papacy. It was written by the humanist and Vatican librarian Bartolomeo Platina and published in February 1485. And after re-examination of both copies by the curator, a little discovery was made. Here on the left, you can see the binding, reused limp vellum made in the 8th, 16th, or 17th century, tooled in gold. This copy was bequeathed to the library by Sir Joseph James Kinsey, a businessman and an agent for several Antarctic expeditions. And it's the only incunabula from his collection. In fact, Kinsey is the only former owner we can identify with certainty, even though the copy also carries Latin marginale and ownership inscriptions from the 15th and 16th centuries. And on the right, you see a first page with a list of the popes, an eligible ownership inscription in the middle, and a Latin inscription in the lower margin. Thematically, it consists of 2 parts. The first one is about the purchase, and the second part is the news of the piece, happened about 2 weeks after the purchase. Here, I give the Latin as it stands, and I left blank the places where the reason is uncertain to me. The first sentence, as I mentioned, is just an ordinary purchase record. The buyer named Carlos paid from his own money for this book. He writes the pecunia sua, which means that this was a private purchase, not for a library or a convent or for somebody else. I haven't identified this owner yet. Well, as you can tell, we have very little information about him. He bought the book in Rome by St. Peter's on Friday, the 28th of July, 1486. About a year and a half after the copy was printed. And he paid 9 carlini for this book. I'd rather not go deep into the price or convert it into days of labor because there's some uncertainty here, depending on whether these were papal or Neapolitan carlini. But for provenance research, even the recorded price on its own is already valuable information. The second part is historical context. The inscription points to the so-called conspiracy of the barons. And to give you some background, I drawn an article by Elisabetta Scarton, professor of medieval history at the University of Udine. So, keeping it short, it was a 2-year conflict. The rebellion of the Neapolitan nobility against their king, Ferrante of Aragon, and Pope Innocent VIII took the barons' side and turned an initial internal crisis into a larger conflict involving major Italian powers. The peace signed in August 1486 in Rome between the king and the Pope was meant to close the active phase of this conflict. And it seems that this is the peace that the book owner writes about. Though the inscription says the peace was made on the Saturday, the 12th of August, 1486, while conventional sources and historians say the day before, on 11th. The book owner records the peace as a settled fact, but little did he know that just 2 days after, on the 13th of August, Ferrante turned the wedding in Naples into a trap and arrested the leaders of this rebellion. But that's another story. The interesting part is that he's writing it as it happens, not knowing exactly how it ends. So it obviously matters for provenance research for a number of reasons. Firstly, the purchase itself. We know exactly when, where, and for how much this copy was bought, which is not a usual case, as you know. And that's very valuable information for history of the book, as I mentioned before. Second, the news itself. We know the historical moment mattered to the book owner, and for whatever reason, he wrote down the news of that peace in Rome. And there's a small irony in it, because he wrote about a peace concluded by the Pope, and he wrote it inside the book on the history of the papacy. And that's another interesting thing about this particular research, and that's why I wanted to talk about it today. We can only find these things as we go looking copy by copy and page by page, and refuse to take the existing description as the last word. So to conclude, it's just over 100 books, right? And cataloging them turned the collection into something bigger. From a single record you can examine to a data set you can analyze, and along the way it gives us a network of New Zealand collectors who had never been on the CERL map before. And a surprising finding, like a discovery of this inscription. And I think it also might be a nice exercise to compare these collections patterns with your own experience of research in libraries, and to spot the differences or common threads in how collections come together in different countries, in different parts of the world, under different circumstances. And that's all from me. Thank you for your time and your attention. I'm happy to answer your questions.
Thank you very much.